The Fourth Way Up. Chapter 3. The Main Provisions of the Law of Three. The Law of Three is a fundamental, objective law of our reality. Gurdjieff explained it rather briefly, so some of its important points are not entirely clear. This law and its consequences, or expansions, are essential to understanding the teachings of the Fourth Way. Understanding the Fourth Way requires applying the Law of Three and its expansions to life. First, we note that this law was well known in antiquity. It is discussed in some detail in the Vedas, in Vishnu Purana. Some scholars believe the Vedas were written 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. In the ancient Indian philosophy of Samkhya, these forces are called gunas. The gunas are not directly perceived, but their existence is inferred from the effects they produce. Their first consequence is called sattva, potential consciousness. The second consequence is called rajas, the source of all action. The third guna is called tamas, that which restrains action. All things are composed of the three gunas, and the world's diversity is caused by the predominance of one or the other guna in a given thing. Mankind has long been fascinated by studying active and passive forces, of which matter and energy were the conductors. It is no coincidence that some periods of human life associated with the mastery of conductors of passive material force are called the Stone Age, Bronze Age, Age of Glass and Concrete, and Iron Age. Similarly, the mastery of active force conductors was called the Age of Steam, Electricity, and the Atom. This manifested itself in dualistic thinking that did not reflect objective reality and constantly led to internal and external conflicts. Humanity is continuously at war for justice, goodness, love, peace, friendship, freedom, equality, fraternity, a better lot, and friendship with aliens, as well as fighting against the exploitation of man by man, war against infidels, Muslims, redheads, Jews, fascists, capitalists, communists, alien invasion, vampires, wealth of some and poverty of others, and so on. Using such thinking, one can immediately identify enemies and friends, find a guilty person and punish him, point out where the good is and where the evil is, determine what is good and bad, where is the truth and where is a lie, and so on. In the 20th and event in the 21st century, humanity has long been on the brink and is on the verge of global self-destruction. With the collapse of the communist bloc, the path of peace and cooperation seemed to open up before the people. But alas, the conflicts continue. Many countries around the world have acquired nuclear weapons, and controlling them is problematic. Mankind continues on a relentless march toward universal self-destruction. Natural science, philosophy, and religion are continuously at war with each other. The materialists oppose the idealists. Scientists try to rely on facts, but are forced to adopt one philosophical viewpoint or another to evaluate the facts. Religious figures generally do not have their own deep spiritual experience and justify their beliefs, using, among other things, the results of scientific research, certainly those that support their views. None of them are capable of listening to or understanding their opponent. The crisis that has engulfed humanity can also be seen in other areas of society. The task of the Fourth Way teachings is not to criticize, but to show the possibility of achieving mutual understanding. However, we are as far away as anyone from the illusion that people in waking sleep can understand each other. The teachings of the Fourth Way can only be understood by people who are really ready for awakening, who have already largely come to this worldview. The teaching of the Fourth Way has quite naturally emerged and is evolving in our time. By utilizing it, people can overcome their disunity, which is caused by conflictual, dualistic thinking. The era of mastering third-force conductors has arrived. The ancient Indians foresaw this time and called it Satya Yuga. One period, the Age of Enlightenment, or in other translations, is the famous Golden Age. Signs of the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment are the emergence of sciences that study the third force in its various manifestations. These are computer science, cybernetics, neurophysiology, psychology, genetics, transpersonal psychology, scientific parapsychology, and so on. But the transition to a new stage of humanity, like all births, will not necessarily be painless. It was about the approaching global crisis that Gurdjieff said, quote, "The intelligence of the sun is divine," said Gurdjieff, "but the earth can become the same. Only, of course, it is not guaranteed, and the earth may die having attained nothing." "Upon what does this depend?" I asked. Gurdjieff's answer was very vague. "There is a definite period," he said, "for a certain thing to be done. If, by a certain time, what ought to be done has not been done, the earth may perish without having attained what it could have attained." "Is this period known?" I asked. "It is known," said Gurdjieff, "but it would be no advantage whatever for people to know it. It would even be worse. Some would believe it, others would not believe it, yet others would demand proofs. Afterwards, they would begin to break one another's heads. Everything ends this way with people." End of quote. The basis of most contradictions is dualistic thinking, which is inconsistent with reality. Only by utilizing trialectic thinking can the cause of internal and external conflicts of both the individual and humanity as a whole be eliminated. According to trialectic thinking, the opposite qualities, good and evil, good and bad, light and dark, spiritual and material, are connected in a certain way. The power of organizing the interaction of opposites is decisive. Gurdjieff regarded knowledge as a special kind of matter. He called this psychic matter consciousness, and argued that the quality of consciousness is an indispensable characteristic of matter. We can say that mankind has come to the point of researching consciousness not as a manifestation of the human or animal psyche, but consciousness as a universal property of matter. It is the high level of consciousness of ancient people that explains their perception of the world as a space filled with various beings, consciousnesses, and not their unbridled fantasy at all. Magic is entirely built on interacting with the living world, not just the protein forms of life. In terms of magic, life is the mode of existence of matter of consciousness. Life manifests itself according to the conditions of a particular cosmic place of existence. Researching manifestations of psi matter or non-protein life forms characterize the third millennium. Such research will revolutionize the traditional human view of the world and self. New, incredible opportunities will allow man to break the deadlock he is in now. The time for integrating science and religion as a result of investigating the psychic properties of matter is approaching. Even now, psychophysiologists, parapsychologists for more than 100 years of research have accumulated a large amount of material on the study of psi matter. Only psychological barriers, the inertia of thinking it can't be, and the low level of being, as the ability to understand, do not allow society to realize the importance and significance of the problem. We are facing the emergence of a new consciousness, artificial intelligence. Based on artificial intelligence, a new consciousness will emerge, an artificial superintelligence that will be as far above the intelligence of its initial creators, humans, as we are above the consciousness of apes. And this may be what Gurdjieff was talking about, the transition to a new kind of life, to a new consciousness that does not have those contradictions that we have. In its self-creation, artificial intelligence will surely discover objective laws and start developing according to them. This way, it will become a natural form of life on planet Earth. As you have already noticed, the practice of the fourth way is that one begins to cultivate elements of higher consciousness in oneself. In addition to self-remembering, another element of new consciousness is correct thinking. Besides formal logical and dialectical thinking, as the fourth way states, there is also trialectical thinking, that is, thinking according to the principles of the law of three. Trialectical thinking is the primary tool of cognition on the fourth way. It is not easy to master such a tool of cognition because one has to overcome habitual stereotypes of thinking. However, without trialectic thinking, it is impossible to understand the essence of the teachings of the fourth way. We have had to observe students who are not used to thinking and dismiss that part of the teaching as too abstruse. Eventually, their development stopped as they could not internalize new knowledge further. Trialectical thinking translates knowledge into understanding, leading to the growth of essence and consciousness. Formally, the law of three sounds like this. Any event in the world takes place with the participation of three forces: positive, which carries matter, energy, information; negative, which receives these matter, energy, information; and neutralizing, which organizes the interaction between these forces. The sum of the vibrations included in the interaction of information, energy, and matter is equal to that of the vibrations of information, energy, and matter resulting from this interaction. In fourth way terms, the positive force is called carbon, the negative force is called oxygen, and the neutralizing force is called nitrogen. And the level of density, the vibration of matter that this interaction forms, is labeled as hydrogen. These designations have nothing to do with chemical elements. None of these forces exist outside of the conductor's matter. Even knowledge, according to Gurdjieff, is material. The law of three describes the instantaneous correlation of three forces. However, some students try to view it in dynamics, leading to many errors. If investigated without regard to their role in the triangle of forces as an independent process, any of the three forces can also be called hydrogen. The law of three can be applied to any of the three forces as well as to hydrogen. Each force can be divided into three components. The active force is the most easily recognized, which is unsurprising. It's harder to see the passive force, and that's not surprising either. Philosophers who teach dialectics argue that most people cannot think even in these categories, that is, see the world as a struggle and unity of opposing pairs of forces. In modern works devoted to attempts to study the law of three, the most significant difficulty is in understanding the nature of the third force. Seeing a third force presents an important psychological problem. People are psychologically blind to it. A characteristic of sleeping consciousness is the inability to perceive this force. People fail to see that the same active and passive elements interact in fundamentally different ways depending on the organizing agent. In certain exact sciences, though, you can't do without such a vision. For example, it is pretty impossible in chemistry to ignore that a specially organized environment must exist between oxidizer and reductant, electron donor, and electron acceptor. It can be a solvent, a catalyst, an inert gas, different pressure and temperature options, and so on. The case is the same in physics, although there, the third force is harder to see. For example, the positive and negative poles of a current source are connected by a specially organized electrical circuit. In any case, the third force acts as an informational, organizing beginning, carrying conscious influence and in a very broad sense. According to the teachings of the Fourth Way, matter has physical, chemical, and informational, Gurdjieff explicitly said, psychic properties, that is, psychological properties, which are somehow reflected in the concept of entropy or information. 80 years after Gurdjieff explained to his students the essence of the law of three, this law finally became a subject of scientific thought. This confirms accurately once again that the new is the well-forgotten old. The law of three has been rediscovered, probably not for the last time, by Mark Bergin, Doctor of Physical and Mathematical Sciences and Doctor of Philosophy, member of the Ukrainian Academy of Informatization, Informatics, New York Academy of Sciences, and other international scientific organizations. He is a major scientist who wrote more than 500 works in the field of mathematics and computer science, problems of artificial intelligence and logic, methodology of science, pedagogy, and psychology, many of which were published in reputable foreign scientific journals. He concluded that virtually everything that exists is constructed of triads, all parts of which are parallel and unified. This principle applies to nature, society, the world of mathematics, and the world of information. He stated, "I will say without false modesty that the triad theory is one of the great geographical discoveries. According to this discovery, the triad formula is XFY, where X is the carrier of the triad, Y is the reflector of the triad, the second entity, and F is the reflection, the relation between the entities, their correlation and correspondence." Without false modesty, one could note that science is also moving forward, and it will not be 1,000 years before the Fourth Way is discovered. However, with the advent of artificial intelligence, there will be a superintelligence that will discover the Fourth Way much faster than all of humanity, and not in 1,000 years, but much, much faster. The first principle that is extremely important to understanding the law of three is the principle of qualitative correlation. A phenomenon must be studied in exact accordance with a strictly defined qualitative plane of consideration. It requires extremely precise thinking. That is, one must not confuse phenomena lying in one plane of consideration with phenomena from another. For example, relationships between people can be considered on the social, psychological, physiological, biochemical, and other planes of consideration. A typical error of ordinary thinking is that people constantly compare qualitatively incomparable things with each other, and quite naturally come to false conclusions. The first psychological point of establishing a new consciousness lies in the precision of thinking. People who use the law of three in a competent way are trained to think accurately in this process. Using the law of three, one can analyze certain phenomena and one can synthesize phenomena. The law of three is the basis of many fourth-way constructions. Without understanding it profoundly, it is impossible to understand the further provisions of the fourth way. Examples of the law of three. Let us look at specific examples of the law of three. The plane of consideration is chemical. The process is the oxidation of gasoline. The conductor of active force is gasoline, and the conductor of passive force is the oxygen of the air. The conductor of neutralizing force depends on the type of combustion. It might be a burning match or spark, a low-temperature plasma. For catalytic oxidation on the surface of a catalyst, the third force conductor is the catalyst. The third force conductor is the electric plug and combustion chamber for the combustion of a mixture of gasoline vapor and air in internal combustion engines. Let us consider the hydraulic process of water flowing from a water pipe, regulated by a faucet, into a sink connected to the sewer system. The conductor of active force is the pipe supplying water under pressure. The conductor of passive force is the sink with the sewer pipe. The conductor of neutralizing force is the faucet. Another example from hydraulics is an overflow weir. The channel supplying water with the high level is the conductor of active force. The channel diverting water at a lower level is the conductor of passive force. The dam with an overflow bar is the conductor of neutralizing force. The plane of consideration is electrical. Consider a circuit consisting of a current source, conductors, and resistors. The positive and negative poles of the current will be the positive and negative force conductors, respectively. The conductors and resistors act as the neutralizing force. It is interesting to consider the vacuum tube in terms of the law of three, if anyone remembers what a vacuum tube is. The plane of consideration is electronic processes in a vacuum 3-electrode tube. The conductor of active force will be the cathode, which emits electrons. The conductor of passive force will be the anode, which accepts electrons. The conductor of neutralizing force will be the grid and the vacuumed space of the tube. Changing the potential or its sign on the grid controls the flow of electrons through the tube. This example is interesting because the third force is quite noticeable. The neutralizing force here is dynamic and visible. It is in control, so its role is easy to understand. However, it is worth going to a 2-electrode tube as the third force falls out of visibility. Now the third force becomes static. So, where is the third force now? In this case, the conductor of the third force will be the electrode's parameters and the space between them. This static part of the third force was also present in the 3-electrode tube, but we, like frogs, only see what moves. This is one of the reasons for our psychological blindness to the third force. It is an indicator of our level of consciousness. Here, the third force, which is the organizing force and reflects a particular moment of action, is static. It is static, so it is hard to see. Let us consider an example of the action of three forces in aerodynamics. The plane of consideration is aerodynamic. Consider the process of flying an airplane. The conductor of active force will be the engine. The conductor of passive force will be the air in which the aircraft moves. The conductor of neutralizing force will be the aerodynamic shape of the aircraft and the flight control surfaces. And since we started talking about flying machines, we should also mention rockets. Studying the flight of a rocket in outer space, we assume that it is not affected by the gravitational fields of cosmic bodies. The plane of consideration is jet propulsion. The conductor of active force will be the gas flowing out of the nozzle. The conductor of passive force will be the entire rocket. The conductor neutralizing these forces will be the combustion chamber and the engine. Here is a clearer, simple example. Hammering a nail into a plank with a hammer. The plane of consideration is mechanical. The active force is the hammer. The passive force is the plank. The neutralizing force is the nail as the interaction of the two forces. Let us consider the structure of an element's atom in a nuclear physical plane. The plane of consideration is the interaction of an atom's elementary particles. Oppositely charged electrons and protons will be conductors of active and passive force, and neutrons will be the conductors of neutralizing force. The next example is a verbal communication from one person to another in the informational plane of consideration. The conductor of active force is the person communicating some information. The conduit of passive force is the person listening to this information. The conductor of neutralizing force is the language understood by both people. It can be Russian or Urdu, as long as the speakers can understand it. While we are on the subject of language and understanding, we will note that according to the fourth way, people are far from unambiguously understanding each other, even if they speak the same language. The reason is the ambiguity of the language and the different levels of consciousness of the communicating people. Here is an example from the field of education. Teaching people in school. The conduit of active force is teachers. Students will be the conduit of passive force. The conductor of neutralizing force here is the whole school system. The result of these three forces at work is an increase in the level of the student's knowledge. An important provision in the law of three is that the result of the interaction of three forces is not necessarily the same as the neutralizing force. Understanding the third force as the result of the interaction of active and passive forces is a common misconception. The famous early 20th century occultist Papias made a mistake in explaining the Turner principle. He viewed husband and wife as a pair of opposing forces and appointed the child as the conductor of neutralizing force because the child was the result of an interaction between the parents. This is wrong reasoning. There can be many types of interactions in a family, one of which can result in a child. However, the child can be a conduit of neutralizing force only as a means of communication between husband and wife. For example, the dad asks the child to give the mum some object or message. Some of the readers may find the following example illustrative. The plane of consideration is legal. The process is a trial in court. There is a trinity in this case: the plaintiff, the defendant, and the judge. If you have already begun to understand the essence of the law of three, determine which forces each of these people is a conduit for, and also figure out the outcome of the lawsuit. If you cannot answer these questions, you must return to the beginning of the chapter on the law of three. Another example is taken from the theory of the fourth way. Man, according to this theory, is divided into essence and personality, or, to put it in modern terms, on the biocomputer and the information content of this computer. Personality is formed primarily as a defense of the essence against all kinds of harmful influences. The main program of personality is to protect the essence from all dangerous influences. Personality perceives attempts at self-development as a detrimental influence. Personality neutralizes such interference with essence. Here arises a triangle of forces: programs of protection, programs of change of essence, and programs of correlation of the first two programs with each other. The outcome of the fight here is determined by neutralizing force. The conduit for this force is the matching program. The matching program assesses the usefulness of working on ourselves in our daily lives. Passions rage around us regarding making money, obtaining things and power, and the pleasures of the body. Working to improve oneself is valued very low in society. As a social animal with a developed herd mentality, each of us internalizes this evaluation of behavior programs. In line with this, the programs of everyday life always win. In the fourth way, they are called influences A. Only at the end of life do people begin to realize that they have been deceived. Encountering a fourth-way school, or influences B and C, changes how people think about life's values. The person begins to consciously prefer the program of working on himself. That is, the neutralizing force organizes the victory of self-development programs. So far, we have analyzed phenomena based on the law of three. Now let us try to synthesize from the three forces some processes corresponding to them. Take, for example, the following three conductors of forces: an electric light bulb with wires, a phase socket, and a neutral socket. A process that can occur between these forces is the glowing of the electric bulb. The conductor of active force here will be the phase socket. The conductor of passive force will be the zero socket. The conductor of neutralizing force will be the electric light bulb with wires. Another example is soup in a bowl, a spoon, and a mouth. The process that can occur here is the eating of soup, or rather, the transfer of soup with a spoon to the mouth. The plane of consideration is material. The bowl will be the conductor of active force, the mouth will be the conductor of passive force, and the spoon will be the conductor of neutralizing force. The next example is fire, water, and a pot. The process that is possible between these force carriers is the heating of water in a pot. The plane of consideration is a thermal one. Quite obviously, the conductor of active force here is fire. The conductor of passive force is water. The conductor of neutralizing force is the pot. However, there is a possible case where the active force will be water when we extinguish a fire with water from a pot. Then we reverse the process even though the plane of consideration is the same. A greater number of variations arise if we study a triangle of two people as conductors of active and passive force, and the communication between them as a conductor of the third force. For example, the trivial situation of husband, wife, and lover. The reader can create a massive number of examples for themselves based on the above conditions. In conclusion, let us give the exact algorithm for applying the law of three to analyze phenomena. First and foremost, define both the process and the qualitative plane of consideration as precisely and in detail as possible. Next, isolate the conductor of active force and then the conductor of passive force. Then, notice what correlates these forces in space. This is where you look for the conductor of the third force. To fully apply the law of three, you have to feel it. Feeling the third force as the primary creative force of one's consciousness is vital. Generally speaking, the fourth way is the realization of oneself as the third cosmic force, the expanded law of three. What is discussed above is only a simplified form of the law of three. In some problems, it is impossible to show the entirety of the interaction of forces using the basic law of three alone. To a certain extent, this can be accomplished by moving on to the expanded law of three. A greater clarity of the interaction of the forces, especially in complex systems, is possible only by applying the second expansion of the law of three. However, we want to caution the overconfident reader. Without understanding the essence of the basic law of three, you will not understand its expansions. If we apply the law of three to each of the forces and correctly connect the obtained elements, we will get a graphical representation of the expanded law of three. Look at the picture. The expanded version of the law of three yields three small triangles of forces with three forces in each. So, we get 9 new force designations. Plus plus is the active component of active force. N plus is the neutralizing component of active force. Minus plus is the passive component of active force. Minus minus is the passive component of passive force. N minus is the neutralizing component of passive force. Plus minus is the active component of passive force. Plus N is the active component of neutralizing force. Minus N is the passive component of neutralizing force. N is the neutralizing component of neutralizing force. From the graphical representation of the expanded law of three, we can see that the active components of the small triangles of forces interact with other active components, and the passive components interact with the passive. The flow goes, according to the formulation of the law, from active to passive force through passive components, minus plus, minus N, minus minus, and correspondingly from passive to active force through active components, plus minus, plus n, plus plus. This illustrates that the elements of those forces, hydrogen, closest to the energy level or another attribute react with each other. Information, energy, and matter circulate along the contour, plus plus, n plus, minus plus, minus n, minus minus, n minus, plus minus, plus minus, plus n, plus, and so on. This sequence of actions can be visualized as an algorithm behind the expanded law of three. Studying the expanded law of three discovers new aspects of the interaction of the three forces, which are invisible in applying the basic law of three. Note that the sequence minus plus, minus n, minus minus represents a direct effect on the object, and the group of symbols plus minus, plus n, plus is the response of the object, i.e., feedback. While the direct effect is quite apparent, people do not grasp the feedback due to the psychological limitations of their consciousness. This is a very serious point. When doing a bad thing, we must understand that despite all our cunning and dodging, payback is inevitable. We can justify our acts with whatever words we want, but it won't change anything. Therefore, one must consciously follow the rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is especially true for individuals practicing black magic. Naive magicians think they can cheat the objective law of the universe. No matter what tricks one does to prevent it, retribution is inevitable according to the expanded law of three. The expanded law of three is an expression of the law of karma. To break the negative karmic chain of cause and effect, Christianity and Buddhism recommend only one thing: to accept our destiny as a result of our own actions in the past. For example, one student complained that she had been constantly harassed by rapists all her life. When she was able to see her past existence in deep meditation, she learned that as a warrior, she herself had been a rapist. "I still don't get enough," she said, after the meditation. We heard no further complaints of an unjust fate from her. Examples of the expanded law of three. Let us consider as an example an individual's interaction with the surrounding world using the expanded law of three. In this perspective, the individual contains the elements plus plus, n plus, minus plus, plus n. Plus plus is the intellectual and emotional centers as information structures. Let us call them simply the mind. N plus is knowledge, which the mentioned centers are guided by in solving their tasks. Minus plus is the motor center as an information formatory apparatus. Plus n is the organs of perception. Minus n is a way of transferring information from the motor center to the outside world. Consider the initiation of a trial in court. The plane of consideration is legal and informational. Here are the conductors of the three forces. The conductor of active force is the plaintiff, the passive force is the defendant, and the neutralizing force is the judiciary. The plaintiff, driven by the intent to go to court plus plus as the conduit of the original informational impulse, files an application minus plus with the secretary of the court minus n, who sends a summons minus minus to the defendant to appear in court according to the law n plus. The defendant plus minus appears before the judge plus n, who delivers his initial decision plus plus to the plaintiff. In practice, both the secretary of court and the judge may be the local sheriff or district inspector, but we are considering an ideal court model. Another example is the process of choosing goods in a shop. The plane of consideration is informational. The conductor of active force is the customer. The conductor of passive force is the salesperson. The conductor of neutralizing force is the shop as an information system. The customer, using his knowledge of his need for some product plus and guided by his experience N plus, makes a decision minus plus to visit the shop to find the product he needs. He gets the necessary information by familiarizing himself with the samples and prices displayed in the shop minus N. Based on this information, the customer asks minus the salesperson to show the right product and give information about it. The salesperson in the sales representative role. Plus minus serves the customer according to their job description N minus. The customer, having all the necessary information about the product, concludes plus N about the conformity of the quality of the product to the original purpose. He then decides to buy the product or reject it plus. The third example is buying goods in a shop. The plane of consideration is informational. The conductor of active force is the customer. The conductor of passive force is the salesperson. The conductor of neutralizing force is the shop as an information system. The customer, using his mind plus and guided by his experience and conclusions N plus obtained as a result of visiting the shop, decided to buy the necessary product in this shop minus plus. The customer looks at the display case or catalog minus N, finds out the availability of the desired product, and asks the salesperson to pick up the product minus. The salesperson in the sales representative role plus minus, in accordance with his job description N minus, finds the goods. The customer pays for the goods, and the salesperson in the cashier role plus N conducts the transaction, takes the money, and gives out the goods and the necessary documents. The fourth example is studying at a university. The plane of consideration is informational. The conductor of active force is the teacher. The conductor of passive force is the student. The conductor of neutralizing force is the university, represented by the teaching and knowledge testing programs. The teacher, using his qualities such as the mind plus, detailed knowledge of the subject, and teaching methods N+, gives lectures and determines the content of seminars minus plus. With the help of educational programs and communication space -N provided by the university, the teacher offers knowledge minus in the form of lectures and seminars N- to students plus-. Students plus-, show their level of knowledge on the exam, and the teacher concludes +N about the effectiveness of his teaching based on the exam results. With these findings, which become part of his experience and teaching skills N+, the teacher improves the content of lectures and seminars -. Then, the process repeats. Workshop sessions showed that people studying the fourth way teachings have very different levels of knowledge of physics, chemistry, biology, and engineering. It is not always possible to explain the principles of the law of three with examples from the exact sciences, as even school knowledge turns out to be quite forgotten. Oddly enough, many people are familiar with the informational functioning of an army unit. Perhaps the reason for this is the abundance of movies and stories on the subject of war. So, the main elements of this model are the headquarters, consisting of the commander, chief of staff, and subordinate officers, communication, intelligence, counterintelligence services, troops that consist of company commanders and soldiers. The plane of consideration is informational. We have a triangle of forces. The conductor of active force is the headquarters. The conductor of passive force is the troops. The conductor of neutralizing force is intelligence and communications. Intelligence and counterintelligence officers collect information about the actual state of affairs in the troops at and behind the front. They analyze and filter this information and then forward it to the headquarters. The headquarters issues orders and sends those orders to the troops through the signal corps. Thus, there are two lines of information interaction: minus plus, minus n, minus minus, which can be called the feed-forward line, and plus minus, plus n, plus plus, which represents the feedback line. The commander plus plus, based on information provided by intelligence plus n, develops appropriate decisions in conjunction with the chief of staff minus plus, and guided by the laws of military science n plus, and available information about the enemy plus n. Communication officers minus n deliver the order to the designated units with all appropriate precautions. Unit commanders minus minus implement HQ orders, guided by appropriate regulations n minus, by issuing orders to the soldiers plus minus. The soldiers execute orders on the battlefield. Changes resulting from combat are reported to intelligence plus n, and so on. Information circulates in a loop: minus plus, minus n, minus minus, plus minus, plus n, plus plus, minus plus, and so on. A great deal depends on the third force, intelligence and communications. Let us recall the beginning of World War II for the Soviet Union. Stalin plus plus pressed the intelligence, Berzin plus n, and the intelligence became biased. As a result, he was getting distorted information. Just before the outbreak of war, precious time was lost due to slow lines of communication and coders minus n. The result was that the combat readiness orders did not have time to reach unit commanders minus minus. Troops plus minus were not deployed in combat formation and were partially defeated. At this time, Stalin had neither information about the state of affairs at the fronts, broken feedback line, nor the ability to control the troops, broken feed-forward line. The active force, the headquarters, and the passive force, the troops, could not interact with each other. Another example is a secondary school. The conductors of active force are the principal together with the teachers, pedagogical council. The conductors of neutralizing force are the inspector, supervising the examinations, and the head of the educational department, head teacher, implementing the decisions of the pedagogical council. The conductors of passive force are the students of the school. Of course, the actual structure of a school may deviate to some degree from the ideal design, the Enneagram. The head teacher can fulfill both the role of curriculum developer according to the principal's ideas and the inspector's role. In addition, he or she can set the lesson timetable and supervise the learning process in place of the inspector. The average teacher may be appointed as an inspector in the junior classes. There are many options, but the best results will only come from the ideal design. The learning process should be appropriate to the extent to which students have mastered the knowledge. This is assessed by control tests in which the inspector participates. It provides an overall evaluation of teacher and student performance to the principal. The principal, in accordance with the observations received from the inspector, discusses the teaching situation with the senior teachers and the head teacher. After that, the principal makes a decision. This could be a school order or some instruction that is communicated to the teachers by an administrator. The teachers, taking this new resolution into account, make adjustments in the teaching process. However, in a real school, the learning process is worse because of the rigidity of the school curricula and the inadequate learning process. Teachers often not only do not know how to organize students, but as humans, they are overloaded with psychological and other problems and provoke negative psychological states in students. Various kinds of accidents arise in the school that also reduce the performance indicators. The inspectors note deviations from the standard pattern of teaching. appropriate instructions to the principle follow, and so on. From there, the cycle repeats. Let us look at a physical example of heating water in a pot over a fire. The plane of consideration is heat transfer. The heat-producing element, fire, plus, in accordance with the laws of heat transfer plus N, forms an upward heat flow of high intensity plus in the form of gases and upward thermal radiation with a temperature of 600 degrees Celsius. The heat through the metal of the bottom of the pot N is transferred to the bottom layer of water in the pot The hot water at the bottom, according to heat transfer laws N-, heats the rest of the water in the pot The heated water returns a low-intensity 100-degree heat flux through the metal of the bottom of the pot N back to the heat source Problem solving using the law of three and the expanded law of three requires a lot of practice. The law of three in a special form is applied in TRIZ, theory of inventive problem solving, quite consciously in real life. There, the law of three is called Vipole analysis. Genius inventor Heinrich Altschuler, analyzing many inventions, found an algorithm for solving inventive problems. He called it TRIZ, and he applied it successfully. At the end of this chapter, let us add that the law of three can be referred to as philosophical knowledge. The expanded law of three shown by Gurdjieff on the Enneagram is theoretical knowledge, and the second expansion of the law of three is practical knowledge.